Welcome back to Questing Beast, I'm Ben. Dungeons & Dragons is not fundamentally a set of rules, although that's how people usually think about it. I think at its heart, D&D is a 50-year-old folk tradition that people have been changing and altering since day one. Hacking the rules is in the very DNA of this game, and that's what I want to talk about today. In particular, I want to talk about one of the rules that I think is hacked more than almost any other, and that is initiative. Why is initiative hacked so much? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a pretty simple rule. It's not a very complex one. Altering it doesn't have too many ripple effects throughout the rest of the system, and it has a very big impact on the experience of combat. And because Dungeons & Dragons is such a combat-heavy game, this means it can have a really big impact on the experience of the whole game. So today I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction on how to start hacking D&D, especially this rule. We're going to look at a whole bunch of different versions of initiative that people have tried to implement over the years, some of which you may never have heard of before. Hopefully by the end of it, you'll have lots of ideas that you can build off of when you are modding the game, and you'll have a better understanding of how these rules affect the experience of playing. And that's the first step in leveling up from a game master to a game designer, which I think is the ultimate destiny of all GMs. Now, the methods I'm going to talk about today are not comprehensive by any stretch of the imagination. There's probably hundreds of possible variants that you could come up with, and people are inventing new ones all the time. But they are some of the biggest methods that I've seen popularly used out there, especially for D&D-like games. If you decide that you want a super deep dive into this topic, I would recommend checking out the blog post, Every Initiative Method, at the blog A Night at the Opera, which was super helpful in developing this video. All right, to start off, let's talk about my least favorite initiative method, which is the standard one used in D&D and frankly in most role-playing games. We can call this the check-based character initiative method. In this, every character makes a check of some kind, oftentimes with modifiers, and then the results of all of those checks determine the order in which all of the characters are going to act. Where to even start with the problems on this? First of all, it is extremely slow, and that is a cardinal sin in my book when I'm running RPGs. If the characters have modifiers to their initiative, then this takes even longer. And this is especially true in more complex games where like the weapon that you're carrying or the type of action that you're performing is also going to affect your initiative. Nearly every game master that I've played with has tried to come up with some technique to speed up this whole process and make it smoother. Sometimes all of the monsters or groups of monsters will go on a single initiative count, so there's a little bit less rolling. A lot of times whiteboards or even little index cards are used where you write down all the characters' names so you can rearrange them so you can remember who's going before who. But the biggest problem that I hear from GMs and that I've experienced is that there's a lot of downtime for each of the players while other players are going. There's a lot of people staring at their phones, just staring off into space, trying to remember, oh wait, is it my turn now? Did you guys skip me? Oh wait, am I going? I thought I was going before him, but I'm actually going before him? It's stuff like that that just grinds everything to a halt. And the thing that really gets me is that, especially in games like 5e, where you have a lot of hit points and death is not really something that happens all that often, you have this really complicated initiative system and it doesn't seem to add very much to the experience of the game. How many 5e combats have you been in where the exact order that the player characters act in had a meaningful impact on how the combat turned out? I'm not saying that it's impossible. There are situations where that can occur, but it's not very common. It also gives relatively few choices to the players. The order that all the characters are going to act in is kind of arbitrary. It's decided by the dice. It's out of the player's hands. And it also disincentivizes players from cooperating with each other since they can't decide the order that they're going to go in. So that is our basic system that we're working from. Now let's look at all of the alternatives that people have come up with trying to solve different aspects of it. Before we jump into that though, this video is sponsored by the Lands of Evershade, the mega hit board game RPG hybrid available to back right now on GameFound. Use the immersive player's handbook to craft the perfect character with races and classes that will change how the world responds to you. It features fast, tactical combat, a huge number of stunning miniatures, and a richly narrated choose-your-own-adventure system with a vast and intricate setting to explore. Lands of Evershade delivers the dream of a full campaign-style experience without the need for a GM. Head over to GameFound right now to back it using the link in the description below. So first, let's look at a much less chaotic system for doing initiative, which we could call fixed character initiative. In this system, you decide what order everyone's going to go in, oftentimes at the start of a session, and then that is the order that you will use in every combat. You might decide this order randomly with some dice. Perhaps you do it using an immutable characteristic on their sheet, like just dexterity order. However you want to do it, you find that order, then you all sit around the table in that order, and you use that every time a fight breaks out. This way, it works basically like a board game. You know that it's your turn to go when the guy next to you has just taken his turn. Now, when do the monsters go? Well, they can all go before the players if they got the jump on the party, or after if not. But however you want to do it, it's going to be much faster than the standard method. Of course, there are trade-offs when you're using this method. There's going to be trade-offs for all of these, especially if you have a group of players that really wants more mechanical depth when it comes to their characters and figuring out the order that things are going to go in. But if your priority is speed, this is one of the best options. But there's other ways that you can simplify this kind of character initiative while giving players a lot more control over how things go. And I think we might call that alternating initiative. It's basically the system that Draw Steel uses. In this system, the players go and they pick one character out of all of their characters. They can decide who this is going to be, and they do all of their actions. Then it switches to the GM side, and they pick one enemy to act. Then we go back to the PCs and back and forth, picking one character at a time until everybody has gone. Draw Steel simplifies this even more by often having groups of monsters that act all at once as a squad, but really that's only necessary if you have a ton of monsters out at once, which Draw Steel often does. Like in Fixed Initiative, this is a dead simple system that is very easy to teach, but it has more strategy and cooperation on the player side because they can talk amongst themselves and figure out who is going to go next, and then plan out how all of their different moves are going to combine together. It is a little bit slower than Fixed Initiative, but not by very much, and I think it works best in systems where the PCs are really powerful and have a big impact when they go. Because if they have a really big impact, then the order that they go in can also have a bigger impact. It will make a bigger difference. If everyone is just moving forward and doing d6 damage, then it's hard to see how the order is going to matter. But if you can blast all your enemies apart and shoot a shockwave through them and throw this guy against the wall, then you can start setting up combos, and that order is going to matter more. One similar version to this that I hear about on the internet a lot is Popcorn Initiative. And all that means is that once a player goes, they immediately nominate another character, either another player character or a monster, to go next. And then after that character goes, they nominate someone else, and so forth, and it bounces around. This works okay, but there's like this weird kind of metagame element where it's hard to figure out what this represents in the fiction. It's a level of gamification of initiative that kind of takes me out of my immersion, and I'm not a big fan of that. And I just think the Draw Steel version is a lot easier to run. All right, the next one is a very popular OSR method for doing initiative that I tend to use in my games like Maze Rats or in Knave 2nd Edition, and that is side-based initiative. In side-based initiative, you're not tracking what order the characters go in. All you care about is the sides. Oftentimes at the start of combat, you will roll a die or maybe do a check of some kind and decide which side is going to go first. Every character on that side acts, and then every character on the other side acts, and you go back and forth. Now, some systems actually re-roll this check, or however you determine it, at the start of every round. So it's possible for side A and then B to go, and then B and then A, meaning one side could act twice in a row. This makes things really swingy if you do things that way. So I tend to prefer not to do that. I just go back and forth. It makes it even faster. So why use side initiative? In my opinion, it is the best method for encouraging cooperation among your players. When all of you are acting at the same time, this means that you're going to take a minute and have a little discussion and figure out how can we all work together to get the most done. What combos can we pull off? In what way can we all work together to achieve way more than we would by just acting individually? As a GM who loves the problem-solving aspects of RPGs, this sort of thing is right up my alley. I love to see the players thinking and planning together. It is a little bit slower than the fixed initiative method because players do have to pause and have a little conversation, but that is fine with me. That is a good trade-off because I actually like that conversation. It also allows players actually to run away more easily because if they get in really over their heads, they can say, okay, we're done. We need to get out of here. And then on their initiative, they all flee, which is something that's much harder to do when you have these initiative methods where the players and the monsters are kind of going back and forth. It's very hard to coordinate in a situation like that. Now, one downside to this method is that it can be kind of swingy, even if you just go back and forth between the two sides and don't re-roll every round. And that's because if everyone acts all at once, they can often get so much done that they can partially wipe out the other side before they even get a turn to act. But what this does is it makes surprise attacks way more effective, which means the players are going to be more careful not to get ambushed and are going to think much harder about how to ambush their enemies. And I like that. Another really big advantage is that there are essentially two states that combat is in when you're using side-based initiative. Either you're in the state where it's the player's turn and they're all thinking and planning and then executing their plan all at once, Or you're in the monster's turn where all of the PCs are being attacked by monsters. So in either of these two states, every player is involved and is interested in what's happening at the table. There aren't any states in combat where it makes sense to just space out and look at your phone because it doesn't concern you. Things are always concerning you. Now, there's a couple of variants on side-based initiative that I think are worth mentioning. The first one I might call before and after initiative, which is used in games like the Black Hack. This is the second edition right here. And how this method works is that all of the players make an initiative check, but what this does is it just determines whether they go before or after the monsters. So the steps are always players go, monsters go, and then slow players go. And then it just repeats over again. So this breaks the PCs into two groups, the before PCs and the after PCs. And each of these groups works like side-based initiative. They can all work together, they can cooperate and so forth. But it adds a little bit more mechanical reward for building characters that have a high initiative or dexterity score or whatever it is that you use. The only cost is that it's just a little bit slower because everyone has to make checks. Another variant on side-based initiative, which breaks things up again a little bit, is what you might call fast and slow initiative. This is used in games like Errant and in Shadow of the Demon Lord. How this works is that every combat is broken down into these steps. You have fast players and then fast monsters and then slow players and then slow monsters. And it always goes in that order. Now, whether your character is fast or slow depends on what actions that you take. If you take just one action, then you're fast. If you take two actions, then you're slow. So most of the time, it just makes sense to do two actions because two actions is better than one. But if you absolutely need to go first for some reason, then you can choose to take just one fast action and you can lock that in. An interesting thing about this system is that it really puts into the player's hands what their initiative is going to be. They kind of get to choose based on what action that they take. And this can be a plus or minus depending on the kind of campaign that you're running, because some people like things to be more chaotic and more unpredictable. Now, our last variant on side-based initiative is one that is not as popular anymore. It was more popular in the past, and that is phased initiative. So in this, when a side goes, the side has to take a number of actions in order. You have to go through each of the steps. For example, in BX D&D, when it's your side's turn to go, first you make morale rolls, then you make any movements that you want to do, then any missile fire, then magical spells, and then finally any melee attacks. You always go through it like that. You also have systems that kind of interleave the two sides. So, side A does morale rolls and then side B does, and then side A does movement and then side B does, and you kind of go back and forth through it that way. Now, I can kind of see why these systems developed. It keeps things very organized. You always know what you can do during this phase, and maybe it helps with analysis paralysis. But fundamentally, I think it's really more designed for games that are run in a wargame fashion. When you have dozens of characters on the table at once, it'll get very confusing if each of them can take very freeform actions. You will have a hard time keep tracking of who's done what and who can do what. Instead, you want to do all of the movement and then all of the missile fire and so forth, just that you know what everyone has done. For much smaller squad-based combat like D&D typically is, I don't see that much of an advantage for it. I think it slows things down a lot, and it kind of takes you out of the immersiveness of the game because you're locked into these steps happening in order. It really removes some of the creativity that players can show off by figuring out what they want to do and what would be the best thing for them to do in a given situation. Because maybe doing that thing doesn't follow the correct steps, even though logically their character should be able to do it. But amusingly, there are some fun situations where people have created phased combat that makes a lot of sense. One of the best examples of this is the Doctor Who role-playing game, where anytime combat breaks out, these are the phases that you have to go through in order. First one is declare actions, and then talking, and then movement, and then doing miscellaneous actions, and then finally fighting. This is actually really fun and super thematic. It actually follows the structure that you see in the TV show, where you can always start talking and running away to avoid anyone who's trying to fight you, because those are always going to happen first. I think that's really fun and clever. Now, the last three systems we're going to take a look at here are ones that are much further afield. You don't typically see them in very many role-playing games, at least mainstream ones, but they're definitely worth taking a look at because they have a really interesting effect on the way that gameplay feels. Now, if you want combat to be truly unpredictable, you can go with Chaos Initiative, and there's a number of ways that you can do this. One way is to give the players cards, and then they form a deck with a card representing their character. You can shuffle it and pull out cards to see who's going to go. One that's also pretty common is one I've seen in Troika, where you have a bag and you're putting tokens into the bag and you're drawing those randomly. It works basically the same way. And you can do stuff where if you have like a higher initiative score or you're a really fast character, you put more tokens in the bag so you're more likely to get drawn. This has a number of interesting effects depending on how you structure it. So for example, if your rule is you have to go through the entire bag before you reshuffle, then you're going to have some characters acting more than once before other characters go, especially if you have multiple tokens in there. Alternatively, you could keep drawing tokens until every character has gone at least once, and then refill the bag and shuffle it again. Or you could do the way that Troika does, where you actually have a token representing, the end of the round that you put into the bag, and when you draw that out, then you reshuffle everything. That final option is extra chaotic because you could go through a whole round of combat and not get to go at all because your token wasn't drawn. Now, Troika does balance this out a little bit by making all of the combat checks contested checks. So even if you don't get to go, if someone attacks you and you rolled high, you could still deal damage to them, so you're still contributing. Now, all of these methods do have the downside of doing a bag building or deck building little mini game before you start every fight, which could be kind of annoying and does slow things down. But the upside of them is that once you have that bag built, then it's very quick to use. You don't have to remember anything or write anything down. You just pull out the token or you draw the card and that tells you who's going next. There's also some interesting tension as every time you reach into the bag and pull something out, you don't know who's going to go. And if there's a really powerful monster on the board, you don't want that to get drawn, but you don't know what's going to happen. So everything becomes very unpredictable, and that can add a lot of enjoyment for certain groups. Overall, though, I don't know if this is much better than standard combat. It's maybe a little bit faster, but the whole process of doing this little mini game, I feel like just slows things down too much. I don't need it personally. Next is one of the most GM-intensive methods, which is simultaneous initiative. And this is exactly what it sounds like. Both sides come up with plans for what they want their characters to do during this round. They reveal their plans, and then they are all executed at once, with the game master figuring out how that's going to happen, resolving any conflicts with checks or making judgment calls. One way to do this is that both sides write down their plans on a piece of paper, similar to how early war games worked, but that could be a little bit of a pain, especially if there's lots of characters. So you're probably going to be declaring them out loud. But then that creates this other issue of who says it out loud first. Because if you say your plans out loud, that actually gives the other side the advantage of knowing what you're going to do so they can react to it. One way is just to randomize who gets to say things out loud first and switch back and forth. Or you could just trust your GM and have your GM come up with a plan and then just dedicate himself to stick with that plan no matter what the players say. But a variant that I happen to like is what you do is the game master goes first, but the game master doesn't say what all of his side's plan is explicitly. Instead, he just gives a little hint as to what the monsters look like they are starting to do, so that the players have an idea that they can plan around, but they don't know exactly what the monsters are going to do. They're going to find that out once everything starts happening. I feel like this gives you a nice middle ground where the players have a little bit of an advantage because they can react to the monsters, but they don't have too much of an advantage and things are still going to be surprising. Needless to say, this method is definitely going to require a GM who is experienced and is really good at kind of smoothing out the rough edges here and making sensible judgment calls when there's weird conflicts that arise. However, if you have a GM that can pull that off, it can be a very rewarding way to play because it is very realistic. This is what combat is actually like. Everything is just going at once. Either you have a good plan or you don't, and then you find out at first contact with the enemy. And finally, the option that all of the PBTA people have been yelling at the screen since I started this video, and that is the no initiative method. This system was popularized by the Apocalypse World RPG. I'm sure there were games before it that did something similar, but this is what really broke it out more into the mainstream. And how this works is, well, it runs combat just like it runs every other part of the game. The GM just narrates what's going on and asks the players generally what they're doing. If the GM decides that the NPCs are doing something, maybe the players get to respond to that. The game master just moves around the table and moves around the fictional world in a way that makes logical sense to them, using their intuition and their judgment to kind of create a dynamic, interesting scene as you go. I've run a number of games of Dungeon World, and I played a lot of World of Dungeons, actually, which is the kind of stripped down version of Dungeon World. And it does make for very fast, very cinematic scenes, but it's definitely not going to be for every player. It does require a very proactive group of players who are paying attention and are able to speak for themselves and kind of interject when they want to do something. Groups that want a more structured, procedural method for running initiative and want things to be more fair, especially if they're very worried about their character dying, are probably not going to like this method much at all. So there's my overview of all of the different initiative systems, at least some of the most popular ones, typically used in role-playing games. Like I said, my goal here is not necessarily to give you a system that you can just grab and take whole cloth, although you can if you want. Really, my goal is to give you lots of examples of ways that these methods affect gameplay. When you're running a game, you need to think about, who are you as a game master? What kind of campaign do you want to run? What are your players like and what are their preferences? What are you trying to incentivize in them by the rules that you're choosing? Do you want to give them a clear mechanical structure that they work inside of? Do you want to give them a more open space that they can improvise and come up with cooperative plans within? Do you want turn order to be decided completely by fate? Do you want it to be fixed ahead of time? Or do you want it to be decided by the actions that the players choose? Is your priority rewarding players for building characters the way that they want to build them? Or is your priority getting through combat as smoothly and as seamlessly as possible? By thinking about this stuff and grabbing the bits and pieces of different systems that work for you, you can create a system that works really well for your table and gives you and your players the best experience. Hopefully this video was helpful for you. Let me know in the comments below if you have your own special initiative system that you want everyone to know about, because I'm always curious to hear about more of those. And thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.